Imagine this: Atlanta, 1913. The air, thick with the intoxicating perfume of magnolias and the relentless humidity of a southern spring. But beneath that genteel facade, a different kind of scent was rising. The acrid smell of fear, the metallic tang of simmering prejudice, and the unspoken tension of a city on the precipice, caught between the vestiges of the Old South and the turbulent churn of industrial modernity. A city where old grievances and new anxieties were about to collide with brutal force. On a seemingly ordinary Saturday, April 26th, that tension exploded into horrific reality. The National Pencil Factory, a bustling monument to progress, had just spilled its workers onto the sun-drenched streets. All except one. 13-year-old Mary Phagan, a child laborer, small for her age. Her young life extinguished in the factory's grim, dusty basement. Her brutally murdered body, discovered hours later, sent a primal scream of outrage echoing through the city and across the nation. The shock was immediate, the demand for justice absolute. But this wasn't just a horrific murder. This was a catalyst. This was the match striking the tinderbox of deep-seated societal anxieties. Almost immediately, the finger of suspicion pointed not at a local, not someone from the familiar streets of Atlanta, but at the factory superintendent, Leo Frank, a Brooklyn-born Jew, an educated outsider in a deeply conservative southern city steeped in its own traditions. He was different, and in a South still scarred by Reconstruction, still grappling with economic shifts and a pervasive distrust of the other. Difference was not just suspect, it was dangerous. The ensuing investigation, fueled by public outcry and sensationalist journalism, quickly devolved from a meticulous search for truth into a grotesque public spectacle. The courtroom became a theater of raw, visceral drama, where flimsy evidence and coerced testimonies were amplified by a collective ravenous mob mentality. A collective hysteria began to fester, intensified by virulent anti-Semitism and a desperate, insatiable yearning for a villain, any villain, to pacify the rampant fear and rage. The very notion of impartial justice was being trampled underfoot. This wasn't just Mary Phagan's murder trial. It became the trial of America's soul. It exposed the terrifying fragility of justice when confronted by unchecked prejudice and the chilling power of a narrative, however false, to overwhelm reason and destroy innocent lives. We're not here to simply recount the sensational twists and turns of a century-old cold case. We're here to dig much deeper, to ask the uncomfortable, enduring questions. What truly happens when the machinery of justice becomes a tool of mob rule manipulated by fear and hatred? What enduring lessons can we as Gen Xers draw from a tragedy that tore a nation apart, setting a horrifying precedent for generations to come? Get ready to journey back to a pivotal yet often overlooked moment in American history, a story that still whispers its dark warnings today. Because the heartbreaking tragedy of Mary Phagan and the profound injustice meted out to Leo Frank serve as a chilling, vital reminder. The echoes of the past are never truly silent, and understanding them is crucial to understanding ourselves, our society, and the ongoing fight for true justice.
Atlanta. The very name, in the early dawn of the 20th century, resonated with the metallic clang of progress and the relentless hum of ambition. A phoenix, indeed, that had risen from the ashes of the Civil War, not just rebuilt, but fundamentally reimagined. Its skyline, once scarred, now bristled with the skeletal frames of new factories reaching for the sky, their brick facades boasting a defiant promise of prosperity. Its cobblestone streets, once quiet, now echoed with the rhythmic clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages and the insistent new roar of automobiles, a symphony of commerce and relentless human drive. The city pulsed with an almost feverish energy, its aspirations soaring to match its booming economy, inviting newcomers with the siren song of opportunity. But beneath this gleaming veneer of success, a different, far more complex reality simmered. Atlanta, for all its grand pronouncements, was a city precariously poised on the precipice, its heart beating with a dangerous, unspoken rhythm of profound social division, racial hierarchy, and simmering resentment. This wasn't just any American city. This was the South's defiant emblem, a testament to its refusal to wither. Cotton mills, vast and tireless, churned out textiles that clothed a nation, their chimneys belching smoke that painted the sky gray. Railroads, like colossal iron serpents, crisscrossed the landscape, connecting distant markets and binding the region to the burgeoning industrial might of the North. Ambitious men, driven by a raw, unyielding hunger for wealth and influence, built financial and manufacturing empires, transforming a scarred land into an industrial powerhouse. Yet, for every glittering new edifice, for every promise of a better tomorrow, Atlanta cast long, dark, undeniable shadows. Shadows where the brutal tenets of Jim Crow laws were not merely suggestions, but rigidly enforced mandates, dictating every aspect of daily life, from the streetcar you rode to the water fountain you drank from. These laws meticulously enforced racial segregation, ensuring that the black community, who had endured slavery and now faced a new, insidious form of bondage, remained systematically disenfranchised and oppressed.
Economic disparity, sharp and unforgiving, carved deep, visible chasms between the opulent, columned mansions of Peachtree Street, where the city's elite reveled in their privilege, and the squalid, overcrowded tenements of the factory districts, where the working class, both black and white, struggled for mere survival.
The very air, thick with the smell of coal smoke, machine oil, and the sweet perfume of magnolia, also carried the faint, acrid scent of fear, injustice, and the unspoken tension of a society teetering on the brink. And at the churning heart of this volatile crucible lay the factories themselves. Places like the National Pencil Company, where the deafening grind of gears, the relentless clatter of looms, and the ceaseless clamor of machinery conspired to drown out the individual voices, the hopes, and the dreams of its countless workers. These were not enlightened workplaces. They were stark, often dangerous, and invariably exploitative environments, meticulously designed for maximum output with minimal, if any, regard for the human cost. Here, in the dim, dust-choked light, children as young as 10 labored alongside adults, their small, nimble hands suited for delicate assembly tasks, their frames slight enough to fit into tight spaces, their futures as dim and uncertain as the grimy factory windows. The hours stretched interminably, from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. The pay was meager, barely enough to sustain a family, and the conditions were ripe for disease, injury, and the quiet despair of perpetual toil. Every whirring spindle, every clattering loom, every pencil produced represented not just an item of commerce, but a life bound to the relentless demands of the industrial machine, a childhood stolen by economic necessity. Society itself, mirroring the factory floor, was a stratified pyramid, rigid and unforgiving. At its apex, the city's wealthy, predominantly white and Protestant elite, descendants of old Southern families or new titans of industry, controlled the purse strings, dictated the politics, and meticulously crafted the prevailing narrative of progress and civility. Below them, a striving, often anxious white middle class clinging to their modest homes and jobs, fiercely guarding their tenuous respectability. And at the very base, the vast, often invisible majority, the black community, systematically disenfranchised, denied basic rights, and relegated to the harshest, lowest-paying labor. And the poor white working class, often sharing living conditions and economic struggles only marginally better, if at all, than their black counterparts, yet indoctrinated with the belief in their inherent racial superiority. It was into this complex, profoundly unequal, and quietly volatile world that Mary Phagan, a mere slip of a girl, stepped each day. Mary was a child on the cusp of womanhood, her 13th birthday just behind her, her 14th barely a month away. Small for her age, with light brown hair often tied back simply, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor that belied the harshness of her circumstances, she embodied the raw vulnerability of her station. She was not a child of privilege, but a child of stark necessity. Like so many other young people of her era, her education had been cut short by the demands of survival. Every Saturday, her paltry earnings from the National Pencil Company were not discretionary spending, but a crucial, often indispensable contribution to her family's meager household income, a precious lifeline in a home that knew hardship intimately.
Her youth, her innocence, her very presence within that deafening, oppressive industrial landscape served as a poignant, living reminder of the pervasive economic pressures that drove countless children into the factories instead of classrooms, robbing them of their childhoods and condemning them to early labor. She was just one fragile face among thousands, yet her story, soon to unfold with tragic intensity, would not only rip the very fabric of Atlanta apart, but expose its deepest, ugliest truths to the unforgiving glare of a national spotlight. The American South of 1913 was a region still wrestling, often violently, with its devastating defeat in the Civil War. It clung to a fiercely romanticized, deeply ingrained sense of honor, chivalry, and a rigid social hierarchy that placed white women on an untouchable pedestal while simultaneously demonizing black men. It was a place where tradition, no matter how archaic or unjust, held immense, almost sacred sway, and where racial animosity was not merely tolerated, but meticulously codified into law, enforced by brutal custom and the ever-present threat of violence. The very concept of white Southern womanhood, pure, delicate, and in need of absolute protection, was held in almost religious reverence. Any perceived affront, any violation, real or imagined, to this sacred ideal, particularly if it involved a black man, could ignite a furious collective rage that swept through communities like wildfire, leading to swift, often lawless retribution. This pervasive atmosphere was not merely the passive backdrop to a crime, it was an active, volatile participant in the unfolding drama, a cultural force that would shape every accusation, every judgment, every headline. The very air of Atlanta hummed with unspoken resentments and simmering frustrations. Black citizens yearning for basic dignity and equality. Poor whites struggling against the tide of poverty and social neglect. And the powerful elite determined to maintain their absolute grip on power and privilege. Each group, often unknowingly, contributed to a societal pressure cooker, slowly building steam, waiting for the smallest spark that would trigger a cataclysmic explosion. And that spark was coming. On the morning of Saturday, April 26, 1913, Mary Phagan,
a mere slip of a girl with a future still unwritten, left her modest home in the working-class suburb of Bellwood for the factory, just as she had done countless Saturdays before. She was headed towards a destiny no one could have possibly foreseen, a horrifying fate that would not only abruptly end her young life, but forever alter the course of justice, expose the raw nerves of race relations, and redefine media sensationalism in America. The gilded cage of Atlanta, for all its shining ambition and grand facades, was about to be profoundly shaken, and the deep-seated tensions hidden beneath its polished surface were about to erupt into a blaze that would consume not just one city, but reverberate across the entire nation, leaving an indelible mark on its conscience.
The air in Atlanta, Georgia, on April 26, 1913, hung heavy, not just with the scent of blooming dogwood, but with an unspoken tension, a societal powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came, not in the grand halls of power, but in the grime and shadows of a pencil factory basement, igniting a firestorm that would consume a city, divide a nation, and etch itself into the darkest corners of American history. This is not just a crime story, it's a chilling excavation of a pivotal moment when justice, fear, and prejudice collided with catastrophic force. In the humid, simmering heart of Atlanta, Georgia, 1913, the discovery of young Mary Phagan's lifeless body ignited an inferno. A chilling act of violence, yes, but what truly set the city ablaze was the immediate, primal demand for a culprit. The working-class masses, the factory hands, the newspaper hawkers, everyone cried for justice. But in the clamor, something far more sinister began to take root, a desperate, almost bloodthirsty need for a scapegoat. And the city, gripped by fear and prejudice, was all too ready to find one. The National Pencil Factory, a bustling hive of industry that Saturday morning, quickly became a crime scene, a crucible where public opinion would be forged in the fires of accusation. Who could have committed such an unspeakable act against a mere 13-year-old girl? Fingers pointed, rumors swirled, and into this volatile mix stepped two vastly different men, whose fates would become inextricably bound by tragedy and injustice. First, there was Leo Frank. He was the factory superintendent, a 30-year-old northerner, Jewish, educated, a graduate of Cornell. In the South of 1913, his very identity was a mosaic of otherness. He was a transplant from Brooklyn, perceived as aloof, intellectual, perhaps even cold. To many Atlantans, he represented a foreign, even threatening element in their deeply traditional society. His northern background already set him apart. His Jewish faith, in an era rife with burgeoning anti-Semitism, rendered him even more susceptible to suspicion. There was an unspoken yet palpable distrust of the outsider, the sophisticated northern mind clashing with southern sensibilities. When Mary Phagan's body was found, the initial spotlight naturally fell on those last seen with her or those in authority. Frank fit the bill. Then there was Jim Conley. He was the factory's black janitor, a man living at the very bottom rung of Atlanta's rigid social hierarchy. Illiterate, with a known record of petty crime and a reputation for drinking, Conley was, by all conventional measures of the time, the more obvious suspect in a city where racial prejudice often dictated who was deemed capable of brutality.
Yet, in a perverse twist of fate, the very same societal biases that would normally condemn him would, in this instance, empower him. His testimony, fluid and contradictory as it was, would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Frank. Why? Because the city had already begun to demand a particular kind of justice, and Conley, in his shifting narratives, offered them the victim they craved. Atlanta in 1913 was a city wrestling with its past and future, still reeling from the Civil War, steeped in Jim Crow laws, and simultaneously embracing industrialization, It was a powder keg of societal anxieties. Racial tensions were perpetually simmering, ready to boil over. Added to this volatile brew was a growing wave of nativism and anti-Semitism, fueled by populist newspapers and firebrand politicians. Figures like Tom Watson, a former congressman and influential newspaper editor, wielded immense power through their words, often fanning the flames of bigotry and fear for political gain. Watson, in particular, would become a relentless, venomous voice against Leo Frank, transforming the trial into a crusade against perceived Jewish degeneracy and northern carpetbaggers. His headlines screamed, his editorials dripped with poison, conditioning the public to see Frank not just as a suspect, but as an embodiment of all they feared about modernization and outside influence. In this poisoned atmosphere, reason and due process withered. The mob mentality, stoked by the relentless media narrative, took hold. The demand for justice transmuted into a cry for vengeance, and Frank, the other, the outsider, the Jew, became the perfect lightning rod. He was cast as the epitome of a depraved northern industrialist, a man who, in the twisted logic of the public, must have harbored dark, perverted secrets behind his intellectual facade. The very fact that he was reserved, articulate, and not outwardly emotional was twisted into evidence of his guilt, a sign of cold calculation rather than grief or shock.
Every detail of his life, every perceived peculiarity, was magnified, distorted, and weaponized against him. The rush to judgment was swift and merciless. The police, under immense public pressure, honed in on Frank with an almost single-minded focus. Despite initial contradictory statements, despite the discovery of highly suspicious death notes found near Mary's body, notes that would prove crucial and point away from Frank, the official narrative quickly solidified. This northern Jew, they proclaimed, was the culprit. It was an easier, more palatable truth for the masses than grappling with the complexities of a city's own deep-seated prejudices, or considering the possibility of a different, perhaps more inconvenient killer. And what of the evidence against Leo Frank? It was, by all objective accounts, flimsy at best, a house of cards built on circumstantial whispers and coerced testimony. There was no direct physical evidence linking Frank to the murder. The only thing they had was the shifting, inconsistent, and ultimately damning testimony of Jim Conley. Conley, initially questioned and released, found himself re-arrested when his story about Frank asking him to dispose of Mary Phagan's body began to take shape.
But Conley's accounts were a tangled web of lies and inconsistencies. He changed his story multiple times, contradicted himself under oath, and offered details that simply didn't line up with the known facts of the crime scene. At one point, he claimed to have written the death notes at Frank's dictation, despite being illiterate. At another, he confessed to moving Mary's body, claiming Frank ordered him to. His narratives evolved with each interrogation, seemingly tailored to fit the prosecution's evolving theory. Yet each new version only served to highlight the unreliability of his word. But in the racialized atmosphere of 1913 Atlanta, Conley's testimony gained an almost miraculous credibility. Typically, the word of a black man, especially one with a criminal record, would be dismissed out of hand in a court of law, particularly against a white man. Yet, because Conley's ever-changing narrative pointed the finger squarely at the alien northern Jew, it was embraced by the prosecution and the public alike. He became the prosecution's star witness, his words, however dubious, given absolute authority. The state's case against Frank hinged almost entirely on Conley's testimony, transforming a series of improbable assertions into seemingly undeniable proof. The prosecution, led by Solicitor General Hugh Dorsey, was a masterclass in narrative manipulation. They painted a lurid picture of Frank as a sexual deviant, an intellectual pervert who had murdered the innocent young factory girl. They expertly played on the existing societal fears and prejudices, leveraging Frank's otherness to construct a compelling, albeit baseless, tale of guilt. They took every scrap of circumstantial evidence, every minor inconsistency in Frank's own truthful statements, and twisted them into damning proof. The death notes, which logically implicated a black man due to their vernacular, were explained away as Frank's cynical attempt to frame Conley. It was a narrative so potent, so aligned with the public's preconceived notions, that the lack of concrete evidence became almost irrelevant. Leo Frank, the outsider, the intellectual, the Jew, was swiftly and brutally transformed into the perfect scapegoat. A city, blinded by its own fears and a desperate hunger for swift retribution, had found its villain. The stage was set for a trial that would expose the dark underbelly of American justice, where truth was malleable and prejudice a devastating weapon. A tragic murder had become a crucible, and in its heat, an innocent man's fate was already being sealed, not by facts, but by the relentless clamor of an unforgiving crowd.
Imagine, if you will, a courtroom less like a chamber of dispassionate justice and more like a gladiatorial arena, its walls vibrating with the raw, untamed energy of a baying mob. This wasn't merely a trial, it was a national obsession, a spectacle of profound, pulsating drama, unfolding under the relentless glare of 1,000 flashbulbs and the fevered scrutiny of an entire nation. Welcome to the trial of the century, a legal proceeding so profoundly warped by public outcry and an unprecedented media frenzy that one could argue justice itself was put on trial. From the moment the massive, ornate doors of that sweltering courthouse creaked open each morning, the very air outside crackled with an almost palpable tension. Thousands upon thousands jostled for a mere glimpse, their faces etched with a complex mixture of morbid curiosity, righteous anger, and an insatiable hunger for retribution. This was no dispassionate inquiry into cold facts. It was a primal scream for an outcome already loudly, unequivocally declared in the court of public opinion. The media, always keen to capitalize on human tragedy, didn't simply report on the events, they amplified them, often distorting them, transforming every whisper, every rumor, every new piece of evidence, or even baseless speculation into screaming, inflammatory headlines that fed the collective frenzy. Daily newspapers, delivered with thudding regularity, were not just filled with sensationalized accounts and lurid details, but often thinly veiled calls for conviction, shaping public perception long before a single witness ever took the stand. Reporters, a ravenous pack, circled the courthouse like vultures, their cameras flashing, their notebooks scribbling, broadcasting every development, every nuanced facial expression, every subtle shift in courtroom demeanor to an insatiable public glued to their radio sets and newsstands. The once sacred lines between objective reporting and outright advocacy dissolved entirely, creating a psychological pressure cooker that threatened to explode within those hallowed halls. The sheer volume of reportage, its often biased slant, made impartiality a near impossibility for anyone involved. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, almost unbearable. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens plucked from their lives and thrust into an extraordinary, terrifying spotlight, couldn't escape the deafening roar of the crowd outside, the constant, unnerving hum of whispers within, or the overwhelming knowledge that the eyes of the entire country, indeed the world, were fixed unblinkingly upon them. Every juror's walk to and from the courthouse became a gauntlet, a terrifying journey through an angry, demanding mob, their faces scrutinized for any flicker of doubt, any hint of dissent from the collective, preordained will.
This was far more than mere public influence. It was public intimidation. a silent yet powerfully pervasive force that hung heavy in the stifling air, threatening to crush any nascent notion of impartiality or independent thought. How could one possibly deliver a truly unbiased verdict when the very ground beneath the courthouse seemed to vibrate with an unyielding demand for blood, for swift, unmerciful retribution? The prosecution, acutely aware of the prevailing winds of public sentiment, masterfully played directly to this raw emotion. Their case was not just meticulously crafted to present evidence, it was painstakingly designed to validate and ignite the public's widespread outrage. They painted a vivid, chilling picture of the heinous crime, dwelling on every horrifying detail with a chilling precision, presenting witnesses whose testimonies resonated deeply with the collective grief, fear, and pervasive anger that gripped the nation. Each piece of carefully selected evidence, each meticulously chosen word was strategically designed to fan the already raging flames of public indignation, to solidify the conviction that the accused was unequivocally, monstrously guilty. Their overarching strategy was less about proving guilt beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, and far more about confirming a foregone conclusion, leveraging the overwhelming emotional tide to sweep the jury along on a current of prejudgment. Meanwhile, the defense found themselves engaged in a desperate uphill battle against not only the formidable prosecution's case, but also an invisible yet omnipresent adversary, the unified fury of the crowd. Their every legal move, every sharp cross-examination, every valiant attempt to sow doubt or present a plausible alternative narrative was met with audible murmurs of disapproval from the packed public gallery, and frequently outright jeers and catcalls from the throngs surging outside. These lawyers, seasoned veterans though they were, visibly struggled against this relentless tidal wave of animosity.
Presenting exculpatory evidence, challenging the often flawed eyewitness accounts, or even daring to question the integrity of the investigation became an almost impossible soul-crushing task. They weren't merely defending their client's life and liberty, they were defending the very idea of a fair and impartial trial against a public fiercely determined to see only one predetermined outcome. It was a truly Sisyphean struggle, an agonizing effort to push a massive boulder uphill against an unyielding hurricane of public hatred and conviction. Any lingering doubts, any glaring inconsistencies, any nuanced alternative theories were simply swept away by the sheer, overwhelming force of collective condemnation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, after weeks of intense, grueling testimony, of relentless legal sparring, amidst a suffocating, circus-like atmosphere, the moment of truth arrived. The jury, visibly strained, even haggard by the immense crushing pressure they had endured, returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict. An unnerving, profound hush fell over the packed courtroom, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the frantic, rapid clicks of press cameras and the shallow breaths of onlookers. Then, the word that would forever echo through the annals of history, satisfying some with a grim sense of vindication, yet shocking countless others, and indelibly cementing this trial's controversial place in the complex narrative of American justice. It was a verdict that, while legally rendered within the confines of the court, felt undeniably, profoundly influenced, perhaps even outright dictated by the deafening cacophony of voices and emotions that had surged relentlessly outside the courthouse walls. It left an indelible, deeply unsettling mark, not merely on the lives of those directly involved, but on the very fabric of how justice was perceived and administered in an era where raw public sentiment could wield such overwhelming, almost absolute power. Was it true justice, delivered with impartiality, or was it a capitulation to the insatiable demands of a frenzied mob? That profound, unsettling question
much like the cold case itself, would linger, unanswered, dissected, and debated for generations to come, a haunting echo in the halls of American history.
The gavel had fallen, the verdict rendered, but for Leo Frank, the fight for his life was far from over. His legal team, relentless and dedicated, embarked on a desperate appeals process, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the American justice system. They argued tirelessly, meticulously dissecting the flawed evidence, the coerced testimonies, the palpable atmosphere of prejudice that had permeated his trial. From the local courts to the Georgia Supreme Court, and finally, reaching the highest judicial body in the land, the United States Supreme Court, every avenue was explored. Each appeal, however, was met with rejection, each legal door slamming shut with a resounding thud, echoing the growing clamor for Frank's execution outside the courthouse walls. The public's hunger for justice, or perhaps for vengeance, had reached a fever pitch, fueled by sensationalist newspaper headlines and fervent anti-Semitic rhetoric. The machinery of the law seemed powerless against the relentless force of public opinion. Then, as the legal appeals dwindled and hope teetered on the brink, one man stood against the raging tide, Governor John Slaton of Georgia. A respected, if politically ambitious figure, Slaton faced an unenviable dilemma. The state's highest court had affirmed Frank's conviction, but the deeper Slaton delved into the trial transcripts, the more unsettling questions arose. He spent weeks poring over every detail, every affidavit, every scrap of testimony. He spoke with key witnesses, re-examined the inconsistencies, and in the quiet solitude of his study, confronted the nagging doubt that Frank had not received a fair trial. The circumstantial evidence, the shifting narratives, the deeply biased jury, it all pointed to a grave miscarriage of justice. Slaton knew that commuting Frank's death sentence to life imprisonment would be a political death warrant for himself, an act of almost unimaginable courage in the face of such widespread public fury. His term was ending, but his conscience demanded action. On June 21, 1915, Governor Slaton announced his decision. He commuted Leo Frank's sentence to life imprisonment, citing his deep-seated conviction that the verdict was not sound and that justice, in this instance, had been tragically compromised. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and explosively violent. The state of Georgia erupted in a paroxysm of outrage. Newspapers screamed headlines denouncing Slaton as a traitor. Mobs formed, their anger palpable, their shouts echoing the cry for blood. They marched on the governor's mansion, baying for his blood, forcing Slaton and his wife to flee Atlanta under the cover of darkness. He was quite literally run out of office, his political career shattered, his name forever linked to the man the public so vehemently wished dead.
But the outrage didn't dissipate. Instead, it coalesced into something far more sinister, far more organized. From the embers of public fury, a new entity arose, shrouded in secrecy and fueled by a burning desire for retribution, the Knights of Mary Phagan. This was no mere collection of angry citizens. This was a carefully orchestrated vigilante group, composed of prominent citizens, lawyers, politicians, and even members of the grand jury that had indicted Frank. They believed that the law had failed, that a Jewish man had escaped his just deserts, and that only through extra-legal means could true justice be served for Mary Phagan. Their rhetoric was steeped in anti-Semitism, conflating Frank's alleged crime with a broader conspiracy. They met in secret, their plans whispered in hushed tones, solidifying a terrifying agenda of mob justice. Leo Frank, meanwhile, was serving his life sentence at the Georgia State Prison Farm in Milledgeville.
He had narrowly escaped a previous attempt on his life by a fellow inmate, a testament to the pervasive hatred that followed him, even behind bars. But prison walls, it turned out, offered little true sanctuary from the venomous rage of the Knights of Mary Phagan. In the dead of night, on August 16, 1915, a chilling silence settled over the prison farm. A heavily armed, masked contingent of 25 men, members of the Knights of Mary Phagan, executed their meticulously planned abduction. They cut the prison's telephone lines, overcame the bewildered guards, and seized the terrified Frank from his cell. Dragging him out into the darkness, they forced him into a waiting car, beginning a harrowing clandestine journey across 175 miles of dusty Georgia roads. The destination was Marietta, Mary Phagan's hometown, a place steeped in the collective grief and incandescent rage of her community. As the sun began to paint the pre-dawn sky with streaks of orange and purple, the convoy reached their grim rendezvous point, an oak grove known locally as Frey's Gin. Here the mob had prepared their gruesome stage. Frank was dragged from the car, his pleas unheard, his terror palpable. The last moments of his life were spent confronting the faces of his tormentors, shrouded in shadow and hatred, representing the very antithesis of the justice system he had once hoped would save him. In a shocking, brutal act of mob justice that reverberated across the nation and around the world, Leo Frank was lynched. His lifeless body was left hanging from the oak tree, a horrifying symbol of a community's unchecked rage, a testament to the chilling power of prejudice and the breakdown of law and order in the Deep South. This wasn't merely a crime. It was a profound stain on the fabric of American justice, an event that would forever mark the tragic intersection of prejudice, fear, and unchecked vigilantism in the Deep South.
From the moment the verdict was slammed down, a dark shadow fell across the halls of justice. Because for many, the truth of what happened to Mary Phagan that fateful April night was far from settled. Despite the roaring crowd and the final gavel, the questions refused to die. Was Leo Frank truly the monster the prosecution painted him to be? Or was he, in fact, a victim of something far more insidious, a terrifying blend of mob hysteria and deep-seated prejudice? The enduring questions surrounding this case, even a century later, still haunt us. Central to these doubts remains the figure of Jim Conley, the factory sweeper whose testimony became the linchpin of the prosecution. Conley, a man with a criminal record, offered no less than 3 conflicting accounts of that day, each more elaborate than the last. He claimed he helped Frank move Mary's body, yet his descriptions of Frank's actions, his calm demeanor, and his improbable instructions seemed utterly at odds with human nature. Why did his stories shift so dramatically? Why was a man with such glaring inconsistencies allowed to dictate the fate of another, particularly when many of his claims defied logic and physical evidence? For many, then and now, Conley was not merely an accomplice, but the prime suspect, weaving a tangled web of lies to escape the gallows himself, skillfully deflecting blame onto the educated Jewish outsider. The very idea that his testimony, riddled with falsehoods, could secure a death sentence continues to send shivers down the spine. But the Frank case was never just about one man. It was a crucible, forging profound and lasting changes in the very fabric of American society. For the Jewish community across the nation, Frank's conviction and subsequent lynching were not just a tragedy, but a terrifying warning. It was a stark, brutal demonstration of the raw power of anti-Semitism, unchecked by law or reason. Out of this profound horror, a new force emerged. In 1913, directly in response to the growing wave of hatred exemplified by the Frank trial, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL was founded. Their mission was clear and urgent: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. The ADL became, and remains, a vigilant bulwark against bigotry, born from the very flames of Leo Frank's injustice.
Yet the darkness did not recede. Instead, it swelled. For as the ADL rose to fight prejudice, another, far more sinister force found new life in the ashes of the Frank case: the Ku Klux Klan. The lynching of Leo Frank, executed by a self-proclaimed group calling themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan, served as a chilling catalyst for the Klan's resurgence. Reborn on Stone Mountain in Georgia in 1915, the KKK, which had largely faded since Reconstruction, capitalized on the widespread anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-Catholic sentiments ignited and fanned by the Frank affair. They seized upon the raw, primal fear and hatred that had consumed Georgia, transforming themselves from a fringe, almost forgotten group into a terrifying national movement. The KKK marched, terrorized, and gained immense power, fueled by the very same prejudices that condemned Leo Frank. The legacy of the Leo Frank case is not one of closed chapters and neatly tied ends. It is a wound on American judicial history, a stark reminder of how easily justice can be perverted when prejudice and public hysteria eclipse truth and due process. It laid bare the fragility of justice in the face of mob rule and revealed the terrifying potential for hatred to be weaponized. The echoes of that dark period, the rise of organized hate groups, the fight for civil rights, the battle against defamation, continue to resonate in our society today. The enduring mystery of Mary Phagan's death, shrouded by the injustice meted out to Leo Frank, stands as a chilling testament to a time when fear, rather than facts, determined a man's fate, leaving behind a legacy of doubt that persists to this very day.